My name is Mike McGrath. I'm joined today by Grace Mann and Julia Reyes, and we'll tell you a little bit more about us as we get started. The session here is presentation of performance under the new marketing rule. I think we'll get started out with some quick introductions of the team. We'll talk about CLE, we'll go to the agenda, and then we'll jump right in. So if I do this right, I will ask Grace to my immediate right to introduce yourself, tell people a little bit about your background.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Grace Mann. I work at Franklin Templeton. I've been there for over 25 years. In the past, I've covered marketing and performance.
Try again.
Okay, in the past, I have covered marketing and performance. And most recently, I cover GIPS compliance for Franklin Templeton products.
Thanks, Grace. Julia, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Reyes. I am a partner at ACA Group in our performance services group, and I have been with ACA for about 15 years now, specifically in performance measurement.
Okay, my name is Michael McGrath. I'm a partner in the Boston office of K&L Gates. And I can tell you that all three of us have spent the vast majority of our professional careers on marketing and advertising matters for investment managers. So we're very excited by the new rule, and we're excited to talk with you about it today. But before we get started, I do want to talk about CLE briefly. The session is eligible for continuing education credit. If you'd like credit for attending, please listen for code words that I'll announce during the session. The first code word is explore. The first code word is explore. Hold on just a moment. This is entirely, don't write down explore.
But you can write down champion.
If you attended the last session, explore was your word. The first word is champion. Julia, you are the champion of the day.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Okay. I promise we'll be more substantive momentarily. Okay. All right, so because we have only 50 minutes and because this is a breakout session, we are not in this session going to just give you a summary of the requirements of the rule. We're going to start from the assumption that you've already seen the rule, you have a general understanding of what's required under the rule, and we're going to spend most of our time on some of the more vexing and challenging aspects of presenting performance under the rule. You see the agenda here. We will start with the big picture. We'll talk about the requirement to have current performance as of the most recent year end. We'll spend a lot of time on gross and net performance. And then we'll talk about related performance, reconciling the rule to GIPS, and hypothetical performance information. If we pace ourselves right, we're going to leave about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you have questions, please write them down. It's a little bit packed, and we're going to ask people to stand up and just shout to the room what the questions are. If you don't want to do that, we will also accept cards. And with that said, let's jump right in. So, the advertising rule, the SEC's former version of the advertising rule, Rule 20641, as it exists right now, did not reference performance at all. And what we know about how we can and can't present performance in advertisements really is derived from no action letters issued by the staff over many, many decades. Now, Grace, it's an entirely different situation now, is it not? And can you give us a little bit of background on the two main considerations that we have when you're presenting investment performance under the rule?
Yes, in terms of sort of building the foundation, I think the SEC really is looking for fair and balance. That's probably the basic foundation of what the SEC is looking for. But as Mike mentioned earlier, there are some prescriptive rules that folks we really need to look at. For example, looking at gross and net performance, you have to present gross and net performance. 1, 5, 10-year performance that you would have to present gross and net performance in regards to that. It could be annualized, it could be cumulative. Related and extracted performance, hypothetical and predecessor performance. We will be covering some of those topics in later slides, but Mike, did you want to add anything else in regards to fair and balance?
I do think that it's very important as we go through this presentation and as you are preparing your programs to really always think I have two obligations here, right? Two distinct obligations. One is prescriptive, and the other is principles-based. And as it pertains to performance, you need to adhere to both of them. Julia, as it pertains to the principles-based requirements, how are you advising clients on how to interpret fair and balanced and what that means? Is it okay, for example, to show how a strategy performed during COVID or highlight certain investments and their performance? How would you advise people to think about fair and balanced in those sorts of situations?
I think you need to look at the advertisement in its entirety and understanding if fair and balanced, if you meet that fair and balanced test throughout the entirety of that presentation. If you're meeting the prescriptive requirements that the rule will now have you place, and there are certain areas that you also want to highlight in addition to that, I think it can be done. You just need to make sure that it's being done in a way that's not any misleading or violates any of those other 7 rules that the rule now has. Anything to add, Mike?
No, I mean, I think that we're going to talk about this interpretation of fair and balanced over time as we go through the presentation. But Grace, I also wanted to pose to you a question. What would be an example of a type of presentation that adheres to the prescriptive requirements of the rule, but is not fair and balanced in the application of those requirements?
So we took an example of, let's say, extractive performance, and this question has been asked to me several times in regards to, hey, you know, we have a global portfolio, and we want to do extractive performance where we extract, let's say, Japanese securities out of a global portfolio and just show the Japanese only section of the portfolio. That would not be considered fair and balanced. So even though it could be considered extractive performance, you have to look at the fact that when you manage Japanese securities, it could be entirely different from managing like a global portfolio. So keep in mind that you know, if you only have like a small percentage in your portfolio that's represented by those securities, then that would not be fair and balanced.
Okay. Let's move on to the current performance requirement under the rule. And for those that aren't familiar, the rule requires, with respect to most presentations of performance, that the performance be recent as of the most be current as of the most recent calendar year end. And what we've discovered in practice is that this creates a lot of practical concerns. There has been some staff guidance on it. Grace, why don't you walk us through the state of play right now and some of the problems that can result?
Yes, in terms of presenting the most recent calendar year end, there was a FAQ in regards from the SEC where you actually have to publish sort of your calendar year end performance within a 30-day window. And of course, you know, if you have thousands of marketing materials, that could present a challenge in regards to how do you update all of your materials, do all your composite calculations and other things within that 30-day window. So in regards to some firms actually do present preliminary performance, and we feel that preliminary performance is perfectly fine to show. But also keep in mind that if there is kind of that sort of material difference between preliminary and final performance, you may want to really kind of think about redistributing that information. If you are claiming GIPS compliance, you do have to follow the error correction rules in regards to doing that.
And I would note that you have to follow the error correction rules if you have preliminary performance on your GIPS report, right? So if you're a GIPS compliant firm, your error correction policies only apply to your GIPS report. If you are including preliminary performance throughout other advertisements that you have, to Grace's point, to the extent it's fairly different from what final ends up being, it might make sense that you need to then redistribute that information. And so potentially, to the extent that you are going to use preliminary performance in advertisements, you may want to look into adopting policies and procedures around how to address material errors with that performance. And
a key consideration here, if you are a firm that claims compliance with GIPS, it probably would not be prudent to have two different standards for redistribution, because you have in writing in your GIPS error correction policy what you have considered to be material thresholds for redistribution of performance. So if you're using preliminary performance, the take home here is GIPS or non-GIPS. The right thing to do is to put in place policies at the outset that describe when you would or would not redistribute performance if your preliminary performance turns out to be wrong. Jumping to the next page, or slide here, we're going to now talk a lot about gross and net performance and go into a little bit more depth on these topics. And the first topic that we're really going to talk about is this equal prominence requirement. And when we talk about the equal prominence requirement here, I think it's important to pay attention, very close attention, to the specific language of the rule. An investment advisor may not include in any advertisement any presentation of gross performance unless the advertisement also presents net performance with at least equal prominence to and in a format designed to facilitate comparison with the gross performance, and also calculated over the same time period using the same type of return and methodology as the gross performance. So Grace, that sounds like a really tight standard. How are we going to apply that in practice?
Well, that's kind of interesting. We've kind of looked at presenting attribution results, and the results are generally reported as gross. So one of the concepts of sort of showing gross and net is that we actually have to calculate net performance for attribution. Now, whether you show it on the same page or not, that could be a consideration in regards to your attribution results. You can show it on the same page, but I've seen attribution results where it can be very cluttered, and it would be perfectly permissible to show it on the next page.
So let's talk a little bit more about showing it on the next page, showing it on the same page, showing it in the body of the same communication. Julia, when you're talking with clients, how do you advise them on this concept of comparability, and what does that really mean? Does it have to be on the same page? Does it have to be on the next page? What works and what doesn't work?
So I've seen a lot of different ways to present performance or other performance-related information. And I would say the general rule that we always try to let our clients know is that you need to think about, again, the broader picture of the entirety of the advertisement. Are you including it in a way that allows for comparability? So one page and the next page, probably fine, right? You can compare the two pages together. Do you have gross on slide 2 and then net performance on slide 60? That's probably not okay. The comparability factor is diminished. But I think one thing for you to consider as well, I've seen pretty frequently actually, is the idea that maybe there's a graph or a table on a page, and the graph will have gross performance, and then maybe there's a table further down on the page that has the net performance. And so you are including that information on the same page technically, but they're in different places. And does that open you up for the consideration that you're not allowing for comparability? Why aren't you putting it in the graph? Those are just some of the questions that we ask. I don't know, Mike, if you have other thoughts around that.
I have a lot of thoughts, but none of them are necessarily informed by the rule or any guidance from the staff, right? And this is, look, this is a challenge that we're going to revisit a lot, because you all heard from Christine earlier today that there are some topics that warrant guidance and warrant FAQs, and there are others that don't. And it is unlikely that we will get guidance from the staff interpreting some of these provisions that really deliberately are left to firms to interpret on their own. I will say that if you have a graph and you're showing just the gross on the graph without a net line, you're subject to some risk there, right? You're subject to some risk there, even if you have on the same page a table that compares the gross and the net. Now, on the other hand, I would say there's also a good argument that you meet the technical requirements of the rule in that situation. And so what you have there is you're balancing some risks, right? You're balancing some risk if you don't show the net performance on the graph. You could do it out of an abundance of caution. But what I would say when you go through that risk balancing process, right now, before we have a better understanding of how this is going to be applied in practice by the staff, I would strongly encourage firms to take a step back and say to themselves, am I satisfying the intent of this rule? In your example, Julia, you had a table on the page comparing gross and net. In my opinion, it seems unlikely that that is the sort of fact that the examination and the enforcement staff is going to latch on to as the occasion that they want to use to make an example of you, but we don't know that for sure, right? But in balancing your risks, I strongly encourage you, have that net performance nearby. Have it on that page, on the next page, don't hide it, and as you balance, try to stick to the principle of what they're trying to achieve here, which is to show the impact of fees. And if you do that on the page, you're probably going to be in good shape, but a lot of this is going to be wishy-washy. We don't have real guidance.
And don't put it in the footnote.
Don't put it in the footnote, because that's not comparable.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the next issue that we want to discuss here is a question that has come up pretty frequently in the last couple of months, which is the treatment of risk metrics. And I want to introduce this conversation by noting that risk metrics can mean a lot of different things, right? And when I hear risk metrics, I think of everything from, some people would say batting average. Certainly we would consider things like information ratio and Sharpe ratio. And then we would consider risk metrics like standard deviation. And there's this huge body of expressions, quantitative expressions that fall within this umbrella. Julia, how do you think about risk metrics, and how have you been advising clients on this issue?
So Grace and I were talking a little bit back and forth about this. The idea of not all risk metrics are the same, right? Some are actually an expression of performance, Sharpe ratio. Some are telling you something about that performance, but it's not performance itself, like standard deviation. And so when you're looking at the rule and the requirement to present net returns for performance, you can't just say, okay, all risk metrics are going to be gross or they're all going to be net. You kind of got to look at exactly what it is that you're showing and determine that if it has to be net alongside of gross.
And I've seen risk metrics where it's actually in a table, so like if you are on one page. So if you are showing gross and net results, you really should disclose that and really kind of make sure that you're using kind of that same calculation methodology. You don't want to use necessarily like gross for standard deviation and net for the other risk metrics on that page.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if maybe it's appropriate and it's okay for you to show gross performance, but if you're presenting it all together in one block on a page, you're saying, maybe it's not the most appropriate to say have net, gross, net mixed in there, and disclosure itself might not cover you, might need to do both anyways, and then disclose that fact within the page.
And that would be one of those situations where you may have adhered to the specific requirements of paragraph D, but it might not be fair and balanced to present in a table some metrics based on gross and some based on net. Now, certainly none of us have the authority to interpret this rule in a manner that you would rely on, but I think it's probably worthwhile, because we talked about this so much in advance of the panel, to lay out risk metrics. How do we think you should look at it? Just 3 people. And I think that a good way to consider risk metrics is to ask yourself, are you looking at a quantitative expression that tells you whether the performance was up or down, high or low, right? And if the answer to that question is yes, it's probably best to treat that risk metric as performance. So this would be like information ratio or Sharpe ratio, as you pointed out. By contrast, if you're looking at a risk metric that measures dispersion or standard deviation, a risk metric that doesn't express that the performance of the portfolio has been good or bad in terms of up or down, but expresses something else, probably not performance. And that's, I think, the best that we can offer on this point. So let's move on. Julia, calculating net performance has been a real challenge for managers for many years for a lot of reasons. And we have now some new opportunities. We have now some new requirements. Could you walk us through some of the troubles that you see in the rule as it's been amended?
Certainly. So one of the things that the adopting release does is it defines what they consider to be net performance. They give a few examples on what would be considered net performance, or need to be included in net performance. But they do acknowledge that the list is not all inclusive. There are things that might start occurring we don't know about that may be considered appropriate to reduce performance by. But for now, you need to be thinking about your advisory fees, any advisory fees that are paid to underlying investment vehicles, and then also any advisory fees that you're paying that the client then reimburses you for. So that's going to include management fees, any type of performance-based fee. You're going to need to consider that as well. And one of the things that I think is interesting in the rule is that it does explicitly call out the fact that extracted performance needs to be net of fees as well, and it needs to be net of the fee that is appropriate to the performance with which you extracted. So we're not getting too much into the definition of what extracted performance is within this presentation, but that's something I think at least as you're thinking about your firm's practices and what kind of performance you're showing, at least that can hopefully be something that you think about. If you see that later on, it kind of triggers a memory in your mind to think about the net performance that you're showing there. They do explain multiple ways with which you can present that net of fee performance. That first one being actual fees, and I know it's not on this slide, but that's the most straightforward, right? Actual, you think it's straightforward. We'll get into why it's not in a second, but there's actual performance and then there's model fee performance. In model fee performance, they've actually given you a few options. Historically, with the JP Morgan no action letter, there's really only one option you had before. The performance had to be, and I'm gonna just read this so I don't get it wrong, no higher than if actual fees had been deducted. So that was option one. So if you're doing that now, you're in line with the new rule. If you want the flexibility that option 2 gives you, there's the potential for that as well. And option 2 allows you to use the highest fee charged to the intended audience with whom the advertisement is for. And so in some cases, option 1 and option 2 are going to be the same, but there is at least the optionality that depending on kind of the markets that you're serving, you have the opportunity to present different fees to those different audiences.
So now we have 3 options, and it seems like all of our problems would be solved because we can choose among those options depending on our situation, right?
Next slide, sir.
Oh, no. So what sort of challenges do we run into if you're trying to use actual fees?
Yeah, so with actual, you have to think about fair and balanced always. But one of the things that you have to think about are non-fee paying accounts, and to the extent that performance, those accounts are included in your performance. So for those firms that are out there claiming GIPS compliance, you might have non-fee paying accounts in your composites. You disclose the percentage of non-fee paying on your GIPS report, and you keep it moving. What the new rule talks about is the fact that depending on how many non-fee paying accounts you have in your composite or in your return, you might actually be misleading prospective investors because that net return is lower than what someone is actually going to get. So if you're using actual net of fee returns, you need to do an analysis to identify if you have non-fee paying accounts in those composites or those return streams. And then if you do, to what extent they impact performance. You know, you've got one of 1,000 accounts in a composite, probably is not going to have an impact. It's one of 2, it will have an impact. So those are the kind of things that you have to think about.
Julia, could I jump in real quick
Sure.
with a supplemental comment there? And you'll note that Julia just made a really important point here about the potential materiality of those non-fee paying accounts. And why are we talking about materiality of non-fee paying accounts when, if you've read the release as many times as I have, you know that at somewhere around page 200 there's a sentence that says if you include the performance of non-fee paying accounts that would be misleading and you have to use model fees. And here's the answer. We talked early on about prescriptive elements of this rule and principles-based elements of this rule. And if you look to the definition of net performance and how you can calculate fees, there is nothing there that says you can't include accounts that pay no fees or that pay low fees. So when we think about what the commission was really trying to express when they had that provision saying, watch out for accounts that don't pay fees, really what that was is an expression of concern of compliance with the fair and balanced standard that applies to all performance. And you can be fair and balanced if you happen to shave off half a basis point or a quarter of a basis point because you have an account among 1,000 that doesn't pay any fees. But to your point, if you have two accounts and it changes your fees from 80 basis points to 30, well, that's clearly unfair and imbalanced. So this really is, there's an element of materiality here. It's not an absolute requirement that you can't continue to have a composite that includes an account without, or that doesn't pay fees. You need to have some threshold, though, that you're comfortable with, that where you could say it is fair and balanced to include these non-fee paying accounts, even though the recipients likely are going to be paying fees. Apologies for the interruption.
No worries. They're really good about saying may be fair and balanced, may not be fair and balanced. And so your firm, to Mike's point, needs to kind of address what that means, and then be able to stand behind that. Close to the non-fee paying are the accounts that are paying a significant reduction in fees. And so they explicitly in the adopting release call out affiliate fees. You're never going to give an affiliate fee to an external third-party prospect. And so how are those in your performance returns? I think standard negotiation, right? You have your rack rate, your standard fee schedule. You're going to negotiate with larger clients, fair, all fine, I think. It's just depending on where there's significant breaks, or you're maybe including employee accounts in returns, and employees are probably not paying anything or only the administrative fees. Those are the kind of things that you need to consider around significant breaks.
Okay, so Julie, if we run into these problems with respect to actual fees, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can solve all of those using model fees in all cases, right? That makes things easy.
Oh, sure. Sure.
Any challenges with that?
So challenges with model fees are going to be, in the instance that you want to continue to show actual, you might have to apply a model fee to those accounts that are impacted in your composite so that it's representative. But if we say, I don't want to go through all that, I'm just going to use a model fee at the aggregate level, and that's the return I'm going to use, you need to decide, are you going with option 1 or option 2? If you're going with option 1, how are you testing to ensure that the performance is more conservative than if actual are used, right? That's something that you have to be able to support. And so I work with a number of firms who have done these type of tests. It's required under the GIPS standards if you're using a model fee. And there are a few ways that you can do this, right? You can look at depending on the number of accounts you have and feasibility of your systems, you can kind of see what your effective fee is for each account. And do they ever deviate from your standard ADV fee? No, then you're probably okay, or you're going to use your ADV fee. What about fees that have changed over time? We're going to talk about this a little bit, but you're required to show that 1, 5, 10-year number. Throughout that 10-year history, is your ADV fee ever changed? Potentially, right, with fee compression. And so what does that look like? Do you then have to go back historically and use the higher fee if accounts were paying that fee? Yes, you do. And so I've seen blended fee rates over time where maybe a firm was using 1.5% up into a certain point, and then once they lowered their fee, they're using 1%, as long as that's still applicable. And so there's a number of ways that you can get to this type of review, but I think the point being that you do have to do an analysis if that's the route that you're going to go.
Well, so Julia, how would you recommend they go about that analysis in practice, right? Is there any easy way for people to approach it, or any recommendations you would have?
Easy way? There isn't really an easy way. Hopefully you have a system in place that is doing your billing for you, so you know what your clients' effective fee rates are, and you can run reports and look at that. If that's not feasible for you, there are contracts with fees, but that's unrealistic. Is there testing that can be done as part of your annual program, right? That you're actually looking at fees and maybe picking 1 or 2 composites per year to make sure that you're meeting that rule. That there's a variety of ways. I don't know if you've seen anything else that could be helpful.
No, I think the biggest challenge here is where managers have been using model fees for some time, and consequently perhaps their record keeping with respect to the actual fees that were paid have been a little bit lax, you might be in a situation where it would be warranted real soon to start reconciling those fees over time to the model fees that you're showing, so that you can demonstrate, if you need to, that the model fees are in fact no lower than and the performance is no higher than what you would show if actual fees had been used.
And Mike, I think if you include fund expenses, they could be extremely high. In fact, it could be higher than what your model fees are. So just kind of keep that in mind, that when you're including funds in composites, usually they have the highest fees in it.
That's actually a really good segue into intended audience. Just quickly, so if you have, let's say, a composite or aggregate, or you're going to have to start using composites if you, potentially, I'll say potentially, if you have multiple accounts in a specific strategy. And if you have funds, as Grace mentioned, and they are paying much higher fees than any separate account would, that's where you have the optionality to use number 2, which is to ensure that it's no higher than a fee of the intended audience, right? So if your intended audience is SMAs, institutional, you could look at the fees within that base and say, this is the model fee we're going to show our institutional prospects. And then when you're marketing your performance to your funds, this is the performance we're going to show to our fund prospects. So you do have the potential there to kind of bifurcate between audiences if that's something of interest to you.
Now, we could really talk about this for an hour or
sorry.
two, but there are a lot of aspects of the rule, so let's jump away from fees for a moment and talk about some other issues we run into. Grace, could you give us a little bit of background on the related performance requirements in the rule and areas where managers might get tripped up in thinking about how to calculate related performance?
So related performance relates to excluding potentially related accounts, but you want to make sure that it doesn't materially improve performance. So if you are a GIPS compliant firm, you already have composites, so that's a definite positive in regards to not having to show all your related performance. So, you know, if, let's say you aren't a GIPS compliant firm, what do? You can certainly use some of the GIPS rules in terms of creating composites. Do you have to claim compliance to GIPS? No, you don't. There are a lot of requirements to claiming compliance with GIPS, which includes doing the GIPS report, as well as really kind of having policies and procedures. But really kind of creating composites really provide you with a strong baseline in regards to knowing, is your performance materially higher, or that you don't want to pick something that improves performance. So in regards to sort of treating rep accounts, it is possible that even though you have composites, you may want to show rep account performance. And again, you want to make sure that it's supplemented by your composite performance, that you don't just show your rep account performance. And again, if you do show rep account performance, you do have to do some additional testing, specifically for periods 1, 5, and 10 years, just to make sure that they're not materially higher.
So Grace, a similar, I'm sorry. Did you
Go ahead, nope.
I was going to say a similar question for you to the one that I asked Julia a couple minutes ago. When firms engage in this testing, right, any recommendations for how a firm could look at their related performance or the rep account that they want to show and ascertain whether or not it's materially higher than the performance would have been if they included all related accounts?
So if you do create a composite, it makes it easier, because that way you can easily compare whether, you know, the rep account performance is materially higher. The other possibility is that you can include all the related accounts, which if you have a lot of accounts in a particular strategy, that could make it challenging. So those are kind of like two of my recommendations. Julia, do you have some additional tests that people can apply for this?
I think that the creation of a composite is really the best way if you have many accounts to identify if you need to use that composite, really. If you're dealing with, less than 10 accounts in a specific strategy, you might be able to eyeball that or, just document kind of what that performance looks like and why you think it's reasonable. But the more accounts you have in a given strategy, the more difficult it is to do that without creating composites.
And again, if you do create a composite, you don't necessarily have to claim GIPS compliance. It can be used for marketing. It can be used for this testing too.
Right. Now, we are going to adhere to our promise to field questions, and that means we're going to keep on moving on to other topics. Julia, a lot of firms claim compliance with GIPS, and it seems almost as though certain aspects of the marketing rule were designed to be harmonious with GIPS. For example, the guidance around selecting or identifying what related accounts are. Now, can we just assume that if we're GIPS compliant, that we're in good shape under the rule and move on?
No, we cannot.
Why not?
For everything I just talked about earlier. So just quickly, because I did go over most of these, I'll also point out the fact that the 2020 GIPS standards allowed you to do carve-outs again. And this is where you're taking, if you have a balanced account and you want to show an equity strategy, you're taking the equity component of those accounts, grouping them together, applying a cash allocation, calling it an equity carve-out composite. You're still allowed to do that within the GIPS standards. Under this new marketing rule, that's going to be considered hypothetical performance. And so there are things that you're doing that you might need to make changes with if you've chosen to take certain routes within the GIPS standards. And then we already talked about the 1, 5, 10 year, right? Adding that to your GIPS report potentially. If you ever use your GIPS report individually, that's not included in a pitch book where you're already probably showing that 1, 5, 10 year number. Net performance we've talked about, and then treatment of non-fee paying accounts we've talked about as well.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up with a quick discussion of hypothetical performance. As a reminder, the rule requires any presentation of hypothetical performance to involve the creation of policies and procedures that are designed to ensure that the hypothetical performance is relevant to the likely financial situation and objectives of the intended audience. That's a new requirement under the rule. It's unlike anything that we've seen in the past. And then it also requires something that's much more familiar, which is a series of disclosures, some of which are designed to ensure that the reader can understand the criteria and assumptions used to calculate the hypothetical performance, and then other disclosures to ensure that the reader understands the risks and limitations of hypothetical performance. But a lot of the questions that we get aren't really around those requirements. They are around, what does this term mean? What does hypothetical performance mean? Because it seems to be pretty broad. Julia, in terms that we can understand, what is hypothetical performance? What are they getting at here?
Big picture, hypothetical performance is anything that was not achieved in an actual portfolio. And that's defined in the adopting release. They explicitly call out back-tested, model, and then also target and projected. So those are the two that are maybe you never thought about as hypothetical before that you now need to consider hypothetical. I think the big thing to think about is the idea around when you're developing policies and procedures and these kind of constraints about when you can show this type of hypothetical performance to prospective investors in private funds or to prospective clients. You want to think about their ability to understand that information. So not all hypothetical performance is going to be created equal, right? Target performance isn't going to be the same as back-tested model performance. And so you don't need to apply the same kind of consideration on when you can show those type of metrics to the prospects that you're showing. You're allowed to have the flexibility to say, we're going to show this one. We're going to show target or projected performance to all of our institutional clients. We feel like they have an understanding, they can understand that. We're not going to adopt the same broad considerations for back-tested model performance. You can do that. That's totally fine. And then you also want to think about, as well as the individuals that are responsible, kind of the level of disclosure that's necessary is going to be different depending on what kind of performance that you're showing as well, and to which audience you're showing that information to. So I think the big thing I want to take away is that just because there's new rules around hypothetical performance doesn't mean that you can't keep showing it. You just have to be a little bit more considerate about how and when you're showing it.
Right. And, a good example of this actually comes for the very last bullet point that we have here, and I'm holding, and Grace is holding a couple slides that came from the prior marketing rule, and, and they were asking, if model performance, right, if a paper portfolio performance is considered hypothetical performance, and a manager in a RAP program wants to put together fact cards and use those fact cards in the RAP program, is that allowed or is it not allowed, right? And the answer is, who's the audience? Because typically when we see those fact cards, they're going to be marked with something like for intermediary use only or for broker-dealer use only. And if you're showing that sort of model performance to the intermediary, that's probably fine. You can assume the intermediary is sophisticated. And if that's where the analysis ended, then the short answer would be yes. Julia, is that where the analysis ends?
No, I don't think that's where the analysis needs to end. I'm the party pooper today. I think you need to take a step further and confirm the fact that that is in fact how they are being used. I think oftentimes you will find they're actually being shared with the reps. And then are they being shared with the reps? Are the reps turning around and sharing that information with their clients and their prospects? And so there is an expectation that you understand how those are being used so that you can understand if it's appropriate or not.
Okay, now we have about 9 or 10 minutes left, and I am really hoping that people brought their questions because we deliberately left some time for questions. And so we have a lightning round, 9 minutes. If anyone has questions, please stand up and be really, really loud when you ask the question. We will repeat it. You're
Not
first.
all at once, yeah.
Okay.
We're right here.
There's also a mic there,
So
too.
we have a fact sheet for one of our strategies, right? And we show net, we show gross, I feel like we do the right thing, everything's good, they're all together, 1, 5, 10, quarter. And then on the next page, we pick a representative portfolio and we describe what that representative portfolio, like which one it is. It's the oldest one. But then we talk about characteristics and top 10 holdings. That's just about the portfolio. That's not performance. Am I okay showing, there isn't net characteristics or net, there's no risk metrics there. Can I continue to do that under the new rule?
Yeah, in the new rule, there's no specific provision that
Nice.
addresses characteristics. But we recognize that you have to draw those characteristics from representative accounts, right? And the way to look at this is if you have selected your representative account in a manner that is consistent with the rule, which is to say either it's truly representative, it doesn't have materially better performance, or if you couldn't quite ascertain that, you rely on the portion of the adopting release that says if you show the performance of the rep account next to the performance of the entire strategy or the entire related performance, to be precise, then you should be in good shape. The one thing that I would say to look out for is when I answer that, I'm kind of assuming that the rep account is representative of the strategy, right?
It's
Yeah.
in the composite. So I forgot to say.
Yeah.
The performance that we're showing, gross and net, is composite performance.
Right.
But then the characteristics in the top 10 holdings, we drag a representative account.
As long as the characteristics are in fact representative of the strategy, you should be fine.
One of the things we also do is include how we choose a rep account in our policies and procedures, so that might also kind of help alleviate the fact that you're picking your best account.
Okay, we have the next question.
So we are an advisor to institutional accounts for whom we provide asset allocation studies. We have capital market assumptions that we include in presentations. Can you give me your thoughts on how to deal with that? Because I'm assuming that that falls under the hypothetical.
There is a provision in the adopting release that explicitly says that if you're providing market indicator or capital market indicators, that it doesn't fall under the provision of hypothetical performance. So as long as that's all you're doing and you're not trying to make any inference to your actual strategy, then you should be okay not to consider that hypothetical.
And
So if we are though, I mean, for example, we use capital market assumptions for each asset class and then use that as how to, how to construct an asset allocation.
yeah, there are a variety, there are several flavors of this exact issue, right? Which is it educational and like a white paper, right? Or is it something that is expressing our performance? And there's no clear answer to that. What I would suggest is when you look at that sort of capital market assumption, look at it from the perspective of the investor, or look at it from the perspective of how the SEC would think the investor looks at it, to be even more precise, and say, would a person look at this and say to themselves that these numbers are representative of what I should expect to receive from your advice? And based on what you just said, the answer here is probably yes, and that's distinguishable from a paper or a piece that simply uses those assumptions to demonstrate the value generically of asset allocation and of not putting all of your eggs in the same basket. For you, though, it sounds like it would probably be treated as performance.
Question for Grace. Grace, when you're calculating attribution, are you calculating a net attribution specifically? Are you doing that at the account level, or are you breaking it down by the security or the sector level?
So when we're looking at attribution, our results are actually gross. I don't know any system that actually calculates net attribution. So we do break out attribution in a lot of different ways. It could be by sector, it could be by country. It could be, that's what I typically have seen in terms of our attribution. So when we were talking about showing net and gross with attribution, we really, because the results are gross, we were talking about applying a model, the highest model fee that you have, to those gross results and really presenting net. So that really is kind of a new concept under this rule. And of course, I don't, whether you show it on the same page, ideally it would be on the same page, but it could be also on the next page.
So when you're looking forward to November 4th, when you do start presenting net attribution and you're applying that model, are you going to be doing it at the account level, or are you going to be doing it at the sector level or the security level?
I see what you're saying. Most likely, we'll probably do it at the sector level. I know that's kind of like fine tuning it to the point of,
That's how you're showing it, right? Then you
Right.
would need to, depends on
because
what
you're
level.
you're breaking down that information. And I think you want to do it so it's comparable, so that when investors see it, they see the gross level and they see the net level.
We're sold on attribution being extracted performance, and we don't have a good argument to the contrary.
It's not.
There's always an argument. But most expressions of attribution are most likely, and by that I mean I recommend that you treat them as extracted performance.
I'm also thinking about what the individual said this morning about not commenting on every question that they get if they don't feel the need to.
If you do a search for the word attribution in some of the proposals and releases that Christine referenced, you will have some more guidance in those.
Thank you.
And then a question for you. Do individual positions within a portfolio need to be reported on a net basis if you're showing the gross and net for the portfolio?
Yeah, I was hoping that you wouldn't ask that particular question, but we're ready to answer it all the same. So that's a really tough one. So if you look to the definition of gross performance in the rule, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have it in the notes. It says the performance of any portfolio, or I believe it says aggregation of related portfolios, or any extracted performance from a portfolio or aggregation of related portfolios. And one way to interpret that would be to mean that if you're showing the performance of an individual position rather than the portfolio, that might not be treated as gross performance, and consequently, you don't have an obligation to include net performance. But because I'm a lawyer and I like, two arguments, the other argument would be, is a single position a form of extracted performance? And if the answer to that is yes, then you would conclude that you do need to show net performance of the individual position. And if, for example, you're one of our private equity friends, that's an extremely challenging thing to do because net performance for private markets is not calculated that way. But in an effort to try to provide an answer, there's at least one passage, and I think there are a couple in the adopting release that refers to the performance of case studies as individual. What's the terminology?
Yeah, I'm looking for the term. You wrote it down.
As specific investment advice. And specific investment advice is a term of art used in the rule, one term of art, and extracted performance is another term of art used in the rule, and ostensibly they don't mean the same thing. And that's a long way of saying there's a good argument that you don't need to show net performance on a position-by-position basis. It's not crystal clear, but it's colorable, it's reasonable. However, if you choose to follow that argument, I think we would all strongly recommend that you have something on the page or very nearby that, without doubt, adheres to the principle of what the rule is trying to do, which is to make sure that the person sees the impact of fees and how that impacts gross and net performance. So, for example, if you're showing a couple individual positions and showing them on a gross basis, the right thing to do here would be to show the performance of the entire portfolio or of the entire composite, gross and net side by side on or nearby on the same page, to ensure that in the event the staff takes a different interpretation than the one I just described, you have nevertheless ensured that you had the principle of the rule there satisfied and that you didn't seek to skirt it. Anything else on top of that?
I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate and say that if you're showing individual security performance and you're trying to say this security performed from this date to this date, and that's the date that you held that security, this is the performance it achieved, then you're trying to show your performance through that security, and there may be an instance where that's considered extracted. So that's the only thing I'll put out there to consider.
So, being that was the toughest question that we anticipated, and that we're about 45 or 50 seconds over time, I think that we will call an end here, but if anybody wants to come up, we'll be around for the next 5 or 10 minutes. Thank you.
We do.
Hold on a moment.
I don't have it. You have it.
Somewhere along there.
After
No, you don't
champion-
want that one. That's the wrong one.
Uh-oh.
What happened?
It disappeared.
There
Okay.
it is.
Hey, everybody, if you're looking for CLE, the second word is complete.
That makes it easy.
Thank you.